Is human consciousness just a really complex type of computation? Could a sufficiently complex machine think, reason, or be conscious? These questions have become hugely significant in philosophy, given the rapid advance of computer technology and artificial intelligence of the past 30 years. Amidst all this, the idea that the mind is like a computer, or that consciousness is a type of computation, has become widespread. In this video, we'll talk about the computation theory of consciousness, and talk about what is probably the most famous philosophical argument against it, John Searle's Chinese room argument. So I recently did a video on what's known in philosophy as zombie arguments, which are arguments about the nature of consciousness and how it can be explained. And we got some really interesting comments, so thank you for them. So this video is kind of an attempt to respond to some of the comments, especially like one of the most significant ideas that came up in the comments. One of the ideas that came up the most was the idea that consciousness is just computation, which I see as a variation on what's called, in philosophy, the computational theory of mind. Now, this is the idea that the brain is a computational machine, and that the mind is a computational process, that the mind, or consciousness, is just a complex computational program running on the brain, or a complex series of computational programs running on the brain. So one of the points of this theory, and why people argue for it, is that it's a way of solving or dissolving one of the core questions, perhaps the core question, of the philosophy of mind, what David Chalmers famously called the hard problem of consciousness. This is the problem of explaining how physical processes give rise to conscious experience, or as Chalmers puts it, even when we have explained the performance of all the cognitive and behavioural functions in the vicinity of experience, perceptual discrimination, categorization, internal access, verbal report, there may still remain a further unanswered question. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? So we now know an incredible amount about how the human brain works, about its physical constitution and processes, about neurons firing and so on. But we still have a long way to go in understanding the brain. And we're still left with the question of how physical processes that go on in the brain result in consciousness, in the subjective experience we have of being ourselves. Physicalism, a philosophical position taken in response to this problem, argues that once we have all the physical facts at hand, we will have solved the hard problem of consciousness. We don't need to posit or have recourse to anything non-physical, or anything over and above the physical, to explain consciousness. But many philosophers, myself included, are sceptical of the idea that we can fully explain consciousness in purely physical terms. I talked about that in the zombie video a bit more, and might come back to it in a future video. But what I'd like to talk specifically about today is the idea that consciousness is computation. So the computational theory of mind emerged as a promising idea for dealing with the hard problem of consciousness. It posits that the brain is literally a type of computer, or computing machine, and that thought, and by extension consciousness, is a type of computation, a kind of program running on the brain. If we think of it this way, we don't need to posit any mysterious extra non-physical thing to explain how consciousness arises from the physical. It is physical. It just is computation. Computers, computation, and computational processes are physically constituted. They're there in front of us and have physical being. We can fully explain how computers work and how computer programs work by appealing to physical properties and processes. It's not a miracle that when I click on the Tetris program in my computer, Tetris starts up. This is all fully explainable by physical processes. Tetris is just something which happens when a computer is programmed and used in the right way. There's nothing mysterious about it, still to be explained on top of that. For proponents of the idea that consciousness is computation, consciousness is also like that. Philosophers might make consciousness seem mysterious, or it may seem like there's something else about it which must be explained, some weird force or subjective quality which the physical can't account for, but there isn't. Consciousness is just what happens when brains evolve to so complex a degree as we have. Our brain computers have become so complex that they're able to run the program of consciousness, just as the most advanced computers are capable of running the most advanced software. But what do we mean by computation here? Well, this concept was around long before computers existed, and actually comes from 19th and 20th century mathematics and logic. There's a really good Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article about the computational theory of mind which explains this, and it has to do with formal symbol manipulation. The manipulation of symbols according to purely formal, non-semantic means. There's an important distinction in this area of theory between syntax and semantics. Semantics is all about the meanings of words and symbols, whereas syntax is about the rules for the correct arrangement of words and symbols, independent of their specific meanings. So the sentence, "This sentence has perfect syntax," is a grammatically correct sentence, but the sentence, "Syntax perfect sentence this has incorrect syntax. The arrangement of the words is grammatically wrong. It violates the rules of grammar. This would be true of any sentence structured this badly, no matter what we were talking about in it, no matter what the meanings of the actual words in it were. Any sentence of this type about anything would have incorrect syntax, no matter its meaning. So an important part of language is the meanings of the words in the language, but another important part of language is the formal rules we have for using the words and symbols and connecting them together. Computation in the technical sense, where we get the word from in the first place, originally meant the manipulation of symbols according to syntactical means, not semantic means. Basically, there are rules for and ways of manipulating symbols which are independent of what the symbols actually mean. The rules of grammar and math apply throughout them, regardless of what the specific sentences or equations are actually about. I guess an example might make this clearer. Let's say, for example, that I were asked to divide 6 by 3. The answer is obviously 2. But this is a purely mathematical question, a purely formal question. It's just about mathematical symbols and the rules for how they might work together. But this type of mathematical question might have a real-world application. I might be dividing casino chips between gamblers after a round of roulette, or I might be dividing food rations between starving families. What 6 and 3 mean in both cases is different, but the equation is the same. It functions the same. It's 6 divided by 3. So we can understand what 6 and 3 mean in both situations in terms of their meaning, semantically, but there is a way of understanding what's going on in them purely formally, in terms of the mathematical processes going on in it, which is syntactically, non-semantically. Originally, something was computable if it was executable, manipulable, decidable, or evaluable formally by a particular mathematical algorithm. But people have long known that any operation which proceeds purely syntactically according to clearly defined rules, symbols, and relations can be executed mechanically. A good example of this would be the calculator. All a calculator does is execute mathematical algorithms mechanically, and the first calculator, or adding machine, was invented by Blaise Pascal way back in 1642. A mathematician can follow an algorithm to work something out, but this same process can be reproduced or simulated purely mechanically by a machine. A machine could calculate something, work something out, solve an equation, or potentially anything that operated syntactically. Eventually, what we normally call computers came along and started doing all sorts of things, sending messages, storing and retrieving information, playing music and videos, and countless other things, all of which involve computers carrying out processes which formally manipulate and represent symbols. But underneath all this complexity, there are understandable, specifiable, physical computational processes which carry it all out. Essentially, the computational theory of mind blows this idea up and applies it to consciousness and rationality. Your conscious mental states are thought of as being representations of symbols, and symbols are exactly what computers manipulate in their computational processes. When you're using a computer, playing a computer game, or using your phone or whatever, and it shows you something, it's executing a computational process, manipulating symbols according to its programming, which results in something being represented to you symbolically in such a way that you can perceive it and understand its meaning. Essentially, in the computational theory of mind, the same thing happens with your mental states. According to syntactic processes performed by the complex computer in your brain, symbols are manipulated according to certain rules, which results in mental states being produced in you which represent something to you symbolically. The experience of pain, for example, or the perception of an object. Now, I should point out that representationalism, as this view of mental states is called, is only one option out of many in the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of perception for accounting for our mental states. And there's a massive amount of debate just about this point. Computational theories of mind often rely on some sort of representational model of conscious mental states, because computers fairly obviously represent things to us by manipulating symbols. So there's an analogy there. But there are reasons to doubt whether representationalism is the best or correct way to understand mental states. But for this video, let's skip over that. So for computational theories of mind, all the massively complex things going on in your brain and in your conscious life, all your thoughts, feelings, perceptions, knowledge, reasoning, experiences, all of this can be reduced to computational processes which underlie them. And these processes are understandable, specifiable, ultimately physical, being executed by the computational machine which is your brain. When people say that consciousness is computation, it means consciousness consists in computation. That's what it is. Computation is sufficient for understanding consciousness and for understanding how it's produced by physical processes. We don't need to posit anything else beyond that. When you really get down to it, consciousness is just a really complex, sophisticated collection of computational processes being performed on an equally complex, sophisticated computing machine. And this machine and these processes are physical in nature. They can be examined and evaluated physically. What we call conscious experience arises from these physical processes, just as the experience of the latest edition of Call of Duty arises from the processes being carried out in your computer. We don't need anything else to explain it. As philosophers might put it, computation is necessary and sufficient for consciousness. We need computation to explain consciousness. It's necessary, but we don't need anything more than that. It's sufficient. Now, we could do an entire series on whether consciousness is computation, and I might return to this topic in a future video. But I'll just be upfront and say that I actually don't think this is a good way to understand consciousness, the mind, rationality, or human nature. I do not think consciousness can ultimately be reduced to computation. I actually think there are a lot of reasons for being skeptical about this, but today we'll get into detail about just one, probably the most famous argument in philosophy that's been made against this view, and one you absolutely have to have some kind of response to if you're going to be philosophically rigorous about this topic and defend the computational theory of consciousness. But as I said, I think there are a lot of reasons to be skeptical of the analogy between consciousness and computation. The work of philosophers like Hubert Dreyfus are a good place to start with this, especially his books Alchemy and AI, What Computers Can't Do, and Mind Over Machine. And in writing these books, he draws a lot on a philosophical tradition called phenomenology, which I also think, over the course of its history, has given us lots of reasons to be skeptical of this idea. But for today, since we're just getting started here, I thought it would be good to talk about John Searle's Chinese room argument. This is almost certainly the most famous philosophical argument against computational understandings of the mind, and it's definitely one of the most discussed, and one that computational theories absolutely must refute if they're going to be on solid philosophical ground. It's too important to ignore. So one of the core assumptions of computational theories of consciousness, one of the things that has to be true in order for the theory to make sense, is that a sufficiently complex computational system must be able to be conscious. This is why you sometimes see quite a confident attitude to the progress of things like AI going along with these theories. Of course a sufficiently complex computer could think. We are complex computers, and we can think. Without this idea, the whole theory kind of falls apart, or at least looks radically different. If a sufficiently complex computer couldn't actually think, reason, feel, or be conscious, all of that, then either we are not conscious, or we need something else to explain consciousness, and the hard problem remains unsolved. Some people do actually bite the bullet on this, on us not actually being conscious. Not all of them are computational theorists of consciousness, but there are some philosophical options out there if you're willing to bite the bullet and concede that we're not actually conscious. Illusionism, for instance, is the view that consciousness is actually an illusion. It's something that appears to be a certain way, but actually isn't. We misrepresent consciousness when we say that it has subjective phenomenal properties, or qualia, as philosophers sometimes put it. Qualia are the private, inaccessible, subjective experiences of conscious states. We might think these are actually real, but it's just an illusion. This view was famously articulated by Keith Frankish in a book called Illusionism as a Theory of Consciousness. So if consciousness is an illusion, or not real in some sense, where do we go from there? Well, an error theory of consciousness might argue that it's technically a mistake to talk about consciousness in the way we do, but it's a useful mistake that we can't really get by without. It's not technically correct to speak of us as having conscious states, as having subjective states unique to us that only we can access, but it's a useful fiction that allows us to get along in the world. If you were an eliminativist about consciousness, however, you would think not only that consciousness as we commonly understand it isn't real, but that we should eliminate all talk of consciousness from our scientific and philosophical theories. It's not real, not a useful mistake, and the concept should have no place in our theoretical attempts to make sense of ourselves. Our common sense understanding of consciousness, mental states, and subjective phenomena is therefore radically wrong. But let's assume for the sake of argument that you want to be a computational theorist of consciousness. You want to say that consciousness is computation, but also that consciousness is somehow real. It's a real thing, and it makes sense to speak of it in this way, in the ways that we normally do. Mental states like believing, feeling, understanding, and so on are real, and are broadly like our common sense intuitions about what they're like. It's just that none of this is anything more than computation. When it comes to our being conscious, this is just a very complex type of communication. Well, if you want to defend that view, you have to defend it against John Searle's Chinese room argument. Now, this was initially articulated as a response to the Turing Test, proposed by the mathematician and computer scientist Alan Turing. He actually called the test the imitation game, but it's become widely known as the Turing Test. There's lots of different interpretations of the Turing Test, and different opinions about what he actually thought about it, or what he was driving at with it. So I'll just give you what I think is the most commonly understood version of it. If any of you would be interested in me actually reading his original paper and discussing it in detail, do leave a comment suggesting that. But for now I'll keep it simple. Turing's imitation game involves two people and a machine. It involves a person who plays the role of interrogator, and the interrogator can talk to the other person and the machine. They can communicate with both. But the interrogator can't see the other person or the machine. But the interrogator knows that one is a person and the other is a machine. And the goal of the game is for the interrogator to find out, by asking them both questions, which one is a human and which one is a machine. The question is, could a computer, or some kind of machine, imitate a human so well that it tricks someone into thinking it's a person? And what should we think of a machine that can do this? But some people might argue that if a machine can pass for a human when competing against an actual human, we should think that the machine is intelligent, perhaps that it can think, or at least that it can understand language. Searle's Chinese room argument was intended as a response to these questions, and he summarises his argument like this. Imagine a native English speaker who knows no Chinese locked in a room full of boxes of Chinese symbols, together with a book of instructions for manipulating the symbols. Imagine that people outside the room send in other Chinese symbols, which, unknown to the person in the room, are questions written in Chinese. And imagine that by following the instructions in the program, the man in the room is able to pass out Chinese symbols which are correct answers to the questions. The program enables the person in the room to pass the Turing test for understanding Chinese, but he does not understand a word of Chinese. The point of the argument is this. If the man in the room does not understand Chinese on the basis of implementing the appropriate program for understanding Chinese, then neither does any other digital computer solely on that basis. And he reflects on what he took the argument to prove in maybe somewhat arrogant fashion years later, like this. He says, I demonstrated years ago with the so-called Chinese room argument that the implementation of the computer program is not by itself sufficient for consciousness or intentionality. Computation is defined purely formally or syntactically, whereas minds have actual mental or semantic contents. And we cannot get from syntactical to the semantic just by having the syntactical operations and nothing else. A system, me for example, would not acquire an understanding of Chinese just by going through the steps of a computer program that simulated the behaviour of a Chinese speaker. So the point of the argument is that the person in the Chinese room is acting in the same way a computer does in the technical sense of computation used in these types of theories. The person in the room is formally manipulating symbols according to predefined rules, programmed by someone else. Just because they're capable of manipulating the symbols in a way that allows them to pass the Turing test doesn't mean they've understood what the symbols mean, or that they understand Chinese. To the person in the Chinese room, these symbols are gibberish. They could mean anything. But they've been told by a system of rules, which have nothing to do with the individual meanings of the symbols, how to manipulate them. But this can all be done without the person understanding a word of Chinese. So if we take the analogy here seriously, it means that computers also can't understand the symbols they're manipulating. The person in the Chinese room is behaving just like a computer does. Symbols get inputted, they receive them and process them according to certain rules, and output whatever they're told to output. But the symbols could mean anything. The person in the Chinese room is completely clueless as to their semantic content. They're operating purely syntactically rather than semantically. The symbols don't mean anything to them. Another way of putting this, as Searle does put it, is that the person in the Chinese room lacks intentionality when it comes to the meaning of the symbols. The meaning of intentionality is complex, and it gets used in lots of different kinds of philosophy, but it's often spoken about as a relationship of aboutness that our mental states have with things in the world, and our experience of the world. Our experiences are always about things, and have some kind of meaningful connection to something. Our perceptual experiences aren't just perceptions of meaningless symbols or nondescript bundles of colours and sounds, but concrete things we understand in terms of their meaning. The person in the Chinese room doesn't have this at all with the Chinese symbols. They might know how to move them around, but they don't understand what they mean. They don't have intentionality of them, or at least not the kind of intentionality that would qualify for their understanding Chinese. They have syntax, not semantics. The Chinese room argument offers us a powerful reason for thinking consciousness is not computation, or at least that it isn't reducible to computation. If it turned out that our mental states did not have intentionality and that our experiences were not meaningfully about what they're about, this would mean that almost everything we understand about our being in the world is wrong. That's how fundamental intentionality is to us. In our consciousness, we don't just process symbols, we understand them. When we converse with others, we understand the meaning of what they're saying to us. However complicated a computer we could build, as long as it operates syntactically, which they all do, it could never actually understand anything. At best, it could imitate understanding. It could even imitate it quite well. But as the Chinese room shows, imitating understanding is not actually understanding. Some common replies to the Chinese room argument concede that the person in the room doesn't understand Chinese, but argue that the system he's a part of as a whole understands it. But to me, this is a weird reply that doesn't really get to the heart of the problem. which is that the system itself would still only have a syntactic, non-semantic understanding. And is that really understanding in the sense we're after at all? Others suggest that even if the person in the room doesn't understand Chinese, through their actions, understanding has somehow been generated because they've manipulated the symbols in a way that's produced understanding, in how the symbols are manipulated and in the mind of their interlocutor on the outside. So the important thing here is that understanding is happening even if the person in the room can't tell you what the symbols mean. This is enough to say that the system is capable of understanding. But again, this is a fundamentally different type of understanding, if it even is understanding, because it has no intentionality. It can't grasp what the actual meanings of the individual words are. So this is the argument I really wanted to put out there in detail in this video. But I think it's really just one in a long line of reasons for not accepting computational theories of consciousness as full explanations of consciousness. Maybe there are parts of our brains that work this way, maybe even quite a lot, maybe even quite a lot of the time they work that way. But this could never be all that there is to being conscious, because we possess intentionality and understand language, which computers do not really, at least not in a semantic sense. There's a whole host of things that computers can't do, that we do all the time in our consciousness, which would give us reason to doubt the analogy or equivalency between computation and consciousness. Computers don't have a history. They don't relate to a social context. They don't live in the knowledge of their mortality. They don't feel, get anxious, get bored, and they don't really understand language. Computer programs can be excellent at doing things which have clearly defined rules and objectives. But what about things that don't have clearly defined rules and objectives? Like being conscious, being intelligent, or using language. These things don't have clear rules and objectives. They have many, which adapt, evolve, and change over time, and are radically open-ended. How do we program a computer to be so open-ended? I've heard that there are people actually trying to do stuff like this, like put programs in situations where there is an objective to complete the situation they're in, but the computer doesn't know the objective and has to figure it out. But I gather this type of inquiry still has a long way to go. AI and computer programs are really good at doing the right things in particular situations with pre-programmed, crystal clear rules and objectives, where what is right and wrong is obvious. But human life is not this kind of situation, and human psychology is an incredibly complex and often counterintuitive thing. People often behave in ways that make no sense at all, and which are against their best interests. A computer would never act against its own interests unless you programmed it to. But this again shows that a computer could never really understand what its best interests are or are not. There's no understanding or concept of this there, but with us, there is. And the reverse is true with computers. There's a ton of things they can do that we absolutely can't. I think when we really look at the best examples of computers imitating intelligence, we actually see how different they are from us rather than how similar they are. One of my favourite examples of this is AlphaZero, a game-playing computer program developed by DeepMind, programmed with the rules of chess and trained to play chess solely by playing against itself, with no access to information about openings, endgames, or strategy. In the first 9 hours of its existence, AlphaZero played 44 million games of chess against itself. In what is effectively the time between lunch and dinner, it went from being completely useless to beating the best computer chess system on the planet. Now, we might think of this as an imitation of a particular aspect of human intelligence, or parts of it, but this is so clearly different from how human intelligence operates. No human mind could process that amount of information that quickly or that well. No one could play that many games of chess in a lifetime. And no person plays chess that well. It consistently beats people, and does so easily. It's operating at such a high level, which wouldn't even be possible for humanity to approach. But I would suggest that this is because it's fundamentally different to human consciousness, not an indication of how similar it is to human consciousness. Thank you so much for watching this video. Do like and subscribe if you'd like to see some more content like this, and do get the discussion going in the comments. If you have any thoughts or criticisms or arguments, do leave us a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. All the best, and see you next time.